Hello Tool Kids, this is Greg Myers at Tools4Teens, and today we're going to do some soldering and some brazing. Well, when you think about soldering, most of the time you think about soldering irons. And here's a soldering iron. It hooks up to the wall with a cord, and then there's a heating element right in here, and then at the tip there's a tip. And the tip might be a sort of a fat tip, or it might be a much finer tip than the other one. And the finer tip is something that you might use working on a circuit board or something like that. And the fatter tip is something you might use when you're soldering together wires that are just, bigger wires like that. Anyhow, the first thing that you need to do with a soldering iron is to make sure that the tip is very clean, and then what you do is you apply some solder to the soldering iron to do something called tinning. Well, soldering irons come in a lot of forms, and they come in the form of a gun too. Now here's a soldering gun, and it has a switch down here, a pistol grip, that gives you a low and a high range. And when you push on it, then you get a light that shines out, and then you have the tip of this, which you also would tin. You'd also cover that with solder. Okay, and you use that, and some people like a gun like that to use. However, people that do a lot of fine work would probably prefer to use a soldering iron. Now basically, soldering is taking two metals and putting some filler metal in between them and heating the works up until the filler metal, which is called solder, melts. So usually when you're doing soldering with electrical things, what you do is you have a solder that is tin and lead, and there'll be a some sort of a little lettering on there, some sort of a little sign that says two letters. Here it says alloy 4060. What that means is that 40% of the metal that you're filling in here is tin, and the rest of it is lead. But that's not the only way that it comes. It comes sometimes another way, and it might be 60-40, and the more tin that's in it, the better it's going to be as a filler electrical conductor. The other thing is that when you're using it for electricity, what you want to do is, you can't see it too well, but there's actually a hole down the center of this, and it's filled with this stuff called rosin. And rosin is something that prepares the surface of the metal that you're filling so that the solder sticks to it better and doesn't oxidize. Now sometimes that is called rosin and in the core, and they say, well, that's rosin core. Sometimes it's actually something else. It's acid inside of the solder, and that's what you would use when you are soldering something like water pipes. Sometimes what you do is you have solder that doesn't have anything inside of it, and you have to dip it in this material called flux to get it to work. And you might do that when you're welding copper pipes or something like that. Sometimes when you don't want to have any lead in something, when you're doing silver soldering. Okay, instead of having the lead in there, you have silver in there, and that is for higher pressure things like air conditioning pipes and things like that. Sometimes when you're working with jewelry, you actually have sort of a paste, and that paste in this case is silver, and there's low melting point silver paste, and then there's higher melting point silver paste, and you use them at different times when you're doing jewelry work. Well, soldering irons come in a lot of forms, and they come in the form of a gun too. Now here's a soldering gun, and it has a switch down here, a pistol grip, that gives you a low and a high range, and when you push on it, then you get a light that shines out, and then you have the tip of this, which you also would tin. You'd also cover that with solder, okay, and you use that. And some people like a gun like that to use. However, people that do a lot of fine work would probably prefer to use a soldering iron. Jewelry work is commonly done with a flame. Now here's a little handheld torch, and you start it like this. And you can adjust the flame, and this is very, very hot. Jewelry work is also done with what they call a micro torch. Now this is hooked up to oxygen and acetylene, and you adjust it here, and this gives a very, very fine flame. Perhaps 7 or 8 millimeters is all that would come out of a torch like this, and that works very well for very fine jewelry work. Okay, we're going to take a look right now at how you would take the jewelry, a piece of jewelry, and take that paste that we showed you and melt the two together. So here's 2 pieces of silver and our torch. Doesn't take much. They're melted together now. That's all it takes. After you let it cool down, you can see that it makes a pretty nice bond. You can barely even see where the solder is on here. Okay, now the trick with soldering is to heat up the actual joint. So here's a hot soldering iron, and what we're going to do is we're going to heat up the metal here. Then the filler material will flow right into it. See how that just kind of slumps in there? And it gets carried along. Pretty cool. Now here's a circuit board, real typical thing that you might find inside of a TV or a radio or stereo system. And all of these pieces on here, all these resistors and LEDs, little lights, and integrated circuits are held in place with solder. Okay, so we're going to turn this over and we're going to look at it where the soldering goes. Okay, now here is a little capacitor, and what we're going to do is we're going to heat it up with this finer soldering iron. See how it's getting more liquid in there? We're going to actually be able to pull that off of there. Let's loosen this side up a little bit. There's one side off, there's the other side off, and there you have it. We took it off. And that's all there is to it with soldering on circuit boards. Well, a lot of times you have to solder something that's bigger, maybe some pipes. Okay, here's some copper pipe that we are going to solder together, and we're going to use that acid type of solder, and we'll heat this joint up, and the solder will get sucked right into the joint. And we're going to use this thing, which is a propane torch. And a propane torch is a handheld torch that you start by turning the knob, okay, opening it up, and then you take a sparker like that makes sparks. Okay, and I don't know if you can see that, but we're going to make it bigger. See that that tip now? See that flame? Okay, we're going to use that flame, and we're going to heat up this joint right here. And the hotter the flame, the quicker this will happen, but you don't want it to happen too quickly because it might cause the whole thing to melt. Okay, it's starting to melt now. You see that? Not melting real evenly here, but I think we're going to speed up the process by using a hotter flame, but it just actually settled into the spot. See how that's melting? Well, it's going to melt even some more. I'm going to show you, I'm going to demonstrate. A little hard to see, but it's getting sucked right into that joint right there. And what you can do is get rid of the excess with a brush. It's all nice and hot in there. You can just get rid of the excess. See how hot that is? It's molten metal. You just get rid of the rest of it with a brush. And the thing to remember is whenever you're soldering something, you want to have the pieces that you're soldering as clean as you can. So wire brush them, use steel wool on them or whatever, and get them as clean as you can. And then between that and the flux that you use, it will make a nice joint. Okay, now we're going to talk about something called brazing. And what brazing is actually taking a piece of brass and getting it hot and putting some flux on it, and then taking it and over to a piece of metal. And the beauty of brazing is the fact you can use different metals and bond them together. It's like soldering, only it's really more effective when you need a really strong joint somewhere. Bicycles were made like this for many years. So here's some sheet metal, and there's some copper, and there's some brass. So what we're going to do is we are going to use an oxyacetylene torch, which is a real powerful gas torch, and we're going to melt right in here and right in here and bond those pieces together. The key word for today is flux. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to take my very powerful oxyacetylene torch and we're going to heat that up, giving it some oxygen. And now what we're going to do is we're going to heat up the end of this brass, and I'm going to stick it in that white flux stuff. Okay, and now what we're going to do is heat this area here up, and as we heat it, what will happen is that that flux which we put on the brass is going to bond to the metal there, and it's going to make it easier for that brass to become part of the bond. See that? That brass is starting to flow right in there. And that's how you would make a bicycle frame. Same exact way. Look at that. Now we're going to, let's use the other kind. This is a brass rod that already has flux on it. I'll give it a little more heat here. And there's the piece of brass here. We're going to heat that brass up and heat that metal up there. There. That didn't take very long, did it, to braze that on there? Just have to get it hot. You can see how brazing is an awful lot like soldering. Only brazing is meant to hold something so well that you could sit on it and ride it down the street. Well, Tool Kids, that's what I've got for you today when it comes to soldering and brazing on Tools for Teens. We'll see you next time.